to see you all. My goodness. Some new faces, some old friends, really fabulous. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. And that's Paris behind me. That's the River Seine.
Very nice.
Oh, will we ever
We
do
wish.
that again?
Well, bonsoir et bienvenue. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to 4 French trailblazers who changed the world. Many thanks to all of you for booking for this series, which has proved extremely popular. I have to say, the most popular Zoom lecture I have ever offered. So let's now have a look at the first of my French trailblazers. And this, of course, is the great French poet and novelist Victor Hugo, a dominant figure of 19th century French literature, and a character who in so many ways was larger than life. On one occasion, the French writer André Gide was asked to name the supreme French poet, and his response was quite a famous one. He replied, Victor Hugo, hélas. So Victor Hugo, alas. He didn't want to name Victor Hugo because he disapproved of some aspects of the man's personality, but he had to admit that Victor Hugo was the supreme French poet. Now, he lived a long life. He was prolific, he was versatile, he wrote poems, novels, epics, plays, travel books, criticism, satires, epigrams, political speeches, history, and diaries. So he was a very prolific writer indeed. His life spanned much of the 19th century. Artists illustrated his books and his poems, composers set his writings to music. In fact, it's been said that over 1,000 musical compositions have been inspired by the work of Victor Hugo. So he became something of a national institution, a symbolic figure of the French 19th century. Here we see a statue of Victor Hugo. He was a legend in his own time. One person who knew him said he was a divine author and a very imperfect man. So I hope this evening to illustrate both of those things for you, the divineness of the author and the imperfections of the man. He was also an incredibly talented artist, so he was not only talented when it came to literature, but in art as well. So Victor Hugo was born on the 26th of February 1802 at Besançon in eastern France. He was the grandson of a wood merchant and a carpenter and the son of a soldier. His parents were very unhappily married, so he did not grow up with a good marital example before him. Both his mother and his father had lovers. His father was an atheist. His mother was a very devout Catholic. And Victor Hugo was convinced that he had been conceived on the night of the 24th of June, 1801. And this, in his great novel, Les Misérables, becomes Jean Valjean's prison number, 24, 6 for June, 01. So the novel is full of really interesting sort of symbolism and connections, such as that one. Here you can see Victor Hugo as a young boy. Now, the family moved often because of his father's position in the army. They spent time in Marseille, in Corsica, in Paris, Madrid, and Naples. And his father rose to the position of General Hugo. His mother's lover, and Victor Hugo's godfather, was actually on the run because he had been plotting against Napoleon, and this man was eventually executed. So the idea of punishment came into the boy's life at a very early stage indeed. And of course, Les Misérables is a novel so intimately connected with punishment. So his father supported Napoleon, his mother supported the royalists. He was sent off to school in the great city of Paris. And on one occasion, he watched the headmaster's daughter putting on her stockings. And from this moment, he grew obsessed with women's legs. Stockings, feet, legs, they feature quite frequently in his fiction. Here we can see his father, the general, and his mother. In 1811, this couple were in Spain with their children. They had gone to join General Hugo because he was involved in the Peninsular Wars. And the young boy ended up seeing a man who was about to be garroted, a particularly gruesome form of punishment. He saw the man absolutely crazy with terror, and this gave Victor Hugo a lifelong loathing of capital punishment. He felt that no matter what crime had been committed, killing a man for that crime was just not the answer. His parents eventually legally separated, something quite unusual at that time. He did have siblings. Here is his brother Eugène Hugo. But Victor Hugo felt that he was way above any of his siblings. And at the age of 14, he decided he was going to be a writer. He commented, "I want to be Chateaubriand or nothing." So definitely a very ambitious boy. Now, he began by writing poetry, and in 1817 he got an honorary mention in the Académie Française Poetry Prize. He and his brother would hold a sort of literary banquet every month. Briefly, he turned to studying law, but that didn't last very long. His mother, Sophie, died in 1821, and 3 weeks later, General Hugo married his mistress. So the home life was a rather difficult one. Then he met this young lady. Her name was Adèle Fouché, and both he and his brother Eugène fell madly in love with Adèle. He ended up getting married to her in 1822. She preferred him to his brother, and the brother, Eugène, was starting to show very disturbing signs of jealousy, depression, and eventually he went completely insane at the wedding dinner for his brother and Adèle. Poor Eugène died 15 years later in a lunatic asylum, and Victor Hugo never once visited his brother. So while in this fiction it was very easy to be sympathetic to the poor and people who lived very tough lives, he failed to show that in real life when it came to his own brother. Now, he and Adèle ended up having 5 children. The first of those died very young, and he does seem, on the whole, to have been a good father while his children were growing up. He commented later that he produced odes and offspring without a moment's rest, so he was a very busy man. He and another of his brothers began producing a periodical called Le Conservateur, a sort of literary journal of the day. So his interest in literature was coming through very strongly indeed from a very early age. Now, his very first volume of poetry, Ode et Poésie diverse, was published in 1822. He was only 20 when he published this volume, and it earned him a royal pension from Louis XVIII. So an extraordinary achievement for a 20-year-old writer. In 1823, he published his first novel, Han d'Islande, or Han of the Island, and that was followed in 1826 by the other novel that you can see here, Boug Jargal. So he was still, I think, struggling to find his proper style as a novelist. These are early works, fairly derivative. So he, as I say, was still sort of seeking his proper style as a mature novelist. And there you can see his signature and an example of his handwriting. So these early prose works were fairly poor, rather Gothic in style, a bit too romantic, rather improbable when it comes to action. But he ended up turning to history as a source of wonderful stories. And his first play was one called Cromwell, based, of course, on Oliver Cromwell in England. This is a very unactable play. It lasts for 500 pages of dialogue. It has 60 characters in it, so making it very hard indeed for a theatre company to stage. And the history in it is completely inaccurate. Victor Hugo knew very little of English history, but he certainly didn't let that stand in his way when he wrote his play Cromwell. In 1828, his father died. More poems rapidly followed. Les Orientales was his next volume of poems. And what he was by this time trying to do was to reform society with his writings. And that, of course, comes through so strongly in Les Misérables. His next book was The Last Day of a Condemned Man, Le Dernier Jour d'un Condamné. And this came out in 1829 and very clearly, as you can tell from the title, reflects his interest in crime and punishment. So by this time, Victor Hugo was being seen as something of an apostle for the Romantic movement, and books such as this one would influence Charles Dickens in England, Dostoevsky in Russia, and Camus later on in France. His plays were starting to become popular. His next play, Hernani, and you can see here the audience getting very excited about it indeed, was an enormous hit in the Paris theatres in 1829. And there were riots in the theatre over this play because Victor Hugo was breaking new ground. He was wanting to make plays move away from the sort of very formal neoclassical model. He wanted them to be much more intimate, much more natural, and this caused, as you can see from this picture, a total riot in the theatrical world. So his disregard for the sort of rules of the day within the theatre upset people, but also delighted many young people. From 1829 to 1840, Victor Hugo published 5 volumes of poetry, and his poetry is superb. So he was really cementing his reputation as the greatest lyric poet of his age. As I mentioned earlier, he was deeply influenced by the Romantic writer Chateaubriand. Here, looking every inch, the Romantic writer with the disordered hair and the brooding, melancholy look on his face. He was the sort of romantic figure who dominated the French literary movements of the first half of the 19th century. But Victor Hugo was breaking new ground with his plays, and more plays appeared over the years. 1831, Marion de Lorme. 1832, Le Roi s'amuse, or the King amuses himself. If you have ever seen the great opera Rigoletto, it is based on this play. So one of the many examples where Victor Hugo influenced the world of music. And his play Ruy Blas, which was thought immoral because it showed bad behavior in high places. And the authorities did not approve of that at all. Now, it was in 1830 that he began his novel Notre Dame de Paris, best known to us in the English-speaking world as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, with, of course, the famous character Quasimodo, the gypsy girl Esmeralda, and as one of the major characters of the book, that great cathedral, Notre Dame in Paris. He wrote the book in 6 months. It was finished in 1831. It is all set in Paris in the 15th century. So this, again, was really breaking new ground because he was going back in history for a novel that he was writing. The book is a wonderful extravaganza. It's got huge energy to it. It's full of improbabilities and very extreme characters, but it is a really fabulous read. And it is the great cathedral that gives the book its unity and its sense of purpose. The book was such a phenomenal success that it was said that the cathedral itself, and if you take out the bottom middle section there, the book looks like a capital H. And people said that Notre Dame was the capital H standing for Victor Hugo. Now, the building itself was in great disrepair when Victor Hugo wrote his novel. The novel was so phenomenally popular, not just in France, but around Europe, that suddenly the French authorities were shamed into doing something to fix the building up. And as you can see from the scaffolding on this picture, this fixing up is still, of course, going on today, most particularly since the terrible fire that took place in Notre Dame not so long ago. Now, Victor Hugo's marriage was not an entirely happy one. By this time, his wife was having an affair with his neighbor and friend, a man called Monsieur Sainte-Beuve, and Victor Hugo had many, many different mistresses throughout the marriage. And there you can see one of the gargoyles. These were actually added to the cathedral a bit later on. They were not an original part of the building. But there's no doubt that Quasimodo and Esmeralda grabbed the imagination of readers around Europe. And suddenly tourists started coming to look at the building because of the novel. And as I say, the French authorities were shamed into fixing up the building thanks to the novel. And you can't say that there are any novels that have resulted in a very thorough restoration of a particular building. The book, of course, covers things like the Black Death and witchcraft and the superstition, the filth, you just feel when you read the book that you are there in 15th century Paris. It is a wonderfully vivid novel. So if you've never read it, do give it a go. So there you can see a picture of Notre Dame Cathedral in the time of Victor Hugo, the 19th century. Now, Victor and his family moved to a truly gorgeous square in Paris, the Place des Vosges. They went there in 1832. He had a house in the corner that you can see there in front of you. And there he had many literary evenings with some of the great writers of the day. And by this time, he was such a famous writer that he was treated as something of a god. Now, the house that he lived in is today a museum, and a rather fascinating one. So you go in through one of these arches, you go up the stairs to the first floor, and you enter one of the many Victor Hugo museums in the world. It has to be said that Victor Hugo would not have been a follower of Marie Kondo and her minimalist style. He adored home decoration. I think had he had another career, he'd have become an interior decorator. Personally, I would not have employed him as a stylist. He loved everything incredibly ornate. So these are just two examples of parts of his home in Paris, which are phenomenally over-decorated. Decorated floors, walls, and even ceilings. Now, he got on with writing. In 1834, he wrote a short story, Claude Gueux. This is about a real-life murderer. So again, his fascination for crime and punishment coming through. And in many ways, this short story is a sort of precursor to Les Misérables. And it was in the 1830s that Victor Hugo began planning this truly great work. He wanted it to be a major novel about social injustice. It would take another 17 years before Les Misérables was published. But in preparation for his book, he went to look at the prisoners at a terrible prison called Bagne de Toulon. It was a very notorious prison. The prisoners lived in terrible conditions, and he took notes while he was there. And these notes would, of course, go into his novel and form the conditions that poor Jean Valjean has to cope with in prison. And he thought originally of the name Jean Tréjean for his hero, but he would end up changing that to Jean Valjean, which is what we have today. And he seems to have known from the very beginning that this book on which he was embarked would be his great work of literature. Now, women would be hugely important in Victor Hugo's life, and we can probably thank this woman, Juliette Drouet, for making sure that Les Misérables was actually published, because she did a phenomenal amount of copying out of the various versions of the manuscript that Hugo wrote. He met Juliette in 1833. She was an actress. She became his mistress, and she was devoted to him for the rest of her life. She shared him with many other different women, but she never lost her passion for this man. At this time, he wrote a new work, and he inscribed it to Victor Hugo's Juliette, more enchanting and more loved than Shakespeare's. Now, Victor Hugo thought that he was way above Shakespeare when it came to the quality of his writing. There was no false modesty about this particular man. He bought her a house nearby so that he could visit her very frequently. He wrote her love poems. She was considered to be a very dazzling beauty. And she had been educated in a French convent. So when he was writing the convent scenes of Les Misérables, Juliette would help him with a lot of the detail for those scenes. Now, Victor Hugo was very worried that he had not been elected to the Académie Française. He tried 5 times to get in, and finally, in 1841, he was elected, and it pleased him enormously. But his plays were starting to drop away in popularity. The sort of plays he was writing were being superseded by something new. So from this time, he focused much more on fiction than on drama. Now, he had a very lovely daughter called Leopoldine. And when she was 19, she was newly married, and this was in 1843. She and her new husband went out in a little boat, and the boat overturned, and both of them were drowned. Victor Hugo was absolutely desolated at the loss of his daughter. In fact, he published nothing for the next 9 years, which I think gives us a very good idea of how grief-stricken he was at the loss of his daughter. She drowned at a place called Villequier. There is now another Victor Hugo museum in that town, and you can see here a bust of his daughter, Leopoldine. From this time, he grew increasingly involved in politics. He spoke out against the death penalty. He spoke about social injustice. He demanded free education for all and, astonishingly, universal suffrage, something that, of course, was very definitely not the case in France at that time. But in spite of his love for Juliette, there were many other affairs. This is a young actress called Léonie Biard. He had an affair with her, and it is thought that she possibly gave birth to his child. Juliette, when she found out, was devastated, and she said, "You have got to choose between the two of us." He said he chose her, but he continued to see Léonie on the sly. In fact, his wife, Adele, actually sort of welcomed Léonie because she hated Juliette so much that she thought maybe Léonie would oust the hated mistress, Juliette. This shows the 1848 revolution in France, and Victor Hugo was deeply involved in all the political maneuverings and discussions of this time. He was elected to the National Assembly, and then in 1851, Louis Napoleon made himself emperor. He became Prince Président and absolute ruler. And Victor Hugo declared Louis Napoleon a traitor to France. So because he was making all these statements about the new ruler of the country, this, of course, was making things very hot indeed for him to remain in France. So, in something of a hurry, he had to flee to Brussels along with his devoted Juliette. So in Brussels, he ended up writing pamphlets, poems, and articles, most of them packed with hatred for Louis Napoleon. Not all of them were accurate. Victor Hugo never let facts stand in the way of something fascinating that he wanted to write, but he was, as a result of all of these writings, officially expelled from France. And then in Brussels, he found also he'd made things too hot to hold him, and he was asked to leave Belgium as well. So where was this man to go? He spoke French. Where was he going to live if he was not in France or in Brussels? So he ended up going to the very lovely Channel Island of Jersey. Now, his son Charles became a very keen photographer, and he actually took these photographs of Victor Hugo perched on a rock that you can still see in Jersey today. And there he is, gazing out towards his beloved France, longing to return to his home country, but of course unable to do so because he was in exile. He loathed the English, he detested the English language, and after 2 years in Jersey, he was extremely rude about Queen Victoria. So the people of Jersey asked if he would kindly leave. They had simply had enough of him. So he ended up moving on to Guernsey. But the place where he stayed, the Pomme d'Or Hotel in Jersey, is still a hotel today. And I, along with my tour group, have been lucky enough to stay in that actual building, which was very special indeed. So he wrote a work called Napoleon le Petit, or Napoleon the Little, really denigrating Louis Napoleon. And in his exile in Guernsey, he really set himself up as the great romantic poet who was perched there on rocks or gazing out towards France, unappreciated by the people in his home country. But he had a very fascinating time in Guernsey, and it was there that so much of Les Misérables was written. And he also was very sorry for the children of the area who were poor, and he would end up very frequently feeding them. Now, this is the rather extraordinary house in which he lived in Guernsey. And it is today part of the city of Paris. It's actually owned by Paris, but it is open to visitors. And it is one of the most extraordinary houses I have ever been into in my life. It's called Hauteville House. Victor Hugo gave full rein to his interior decorating instincts. It's a mixture of classical, romantic, exotic, and medieval. And this was his home from 1855 to 1870. Now, this is one of his writing rooms up at the very top of the house. It gets very hot because it's, as you can see, lots of glass. But he loved the fact that he could look out over the town. And one of the things he loved to do when writing in this room was to take off all his clothes and write in the nude. Just along the street was where his mistress, Juliette, was living in a house. And she could actually look out of her window straight up to that glassed area at the top of the house, and she could see her lover posing there in the nude. So a rather fascinating little story. Now, I have taken tour groups into this house, and I think that most of us actually came out with a headache because it was so over-decorated. I have never in my entire life seen a house that was as decorated as this one. Every surface was decorated. And in some of the rooms that you go into, there are actually plates stuck up on the ceiling. So everywhere you look, there is something. Marie Kondo would have a complete fit if she were to see this house. But he loved going to junk shops and antique shops and buying things for it. He was truly fascinated by the house decorating that he indulged in. His wife didn't really want to live in the Channel Islands. She would come for the odd visit, but she preferred really to live in France. This is his daughter, Adele Hugo. And by this time, poor Adele was in a very serious mental state. She ended up eventually chasing a man to America, and she had to be brought home, and she would spend 43 years of her life in a mental asylum. Her father seems to have shown her very little understanding. He commented that she should seek her pleasure in moral satisfaction. Now, coming from a man with as many mistresses as Victor Hugo, that does rather reek of hypocrisy. She ended up dying in the asylum, and her story has been told in the Francois Truffaut movie, The Story of Adele H. So if you want to learn more about her, you might like to watch that film. And here you can see Victor Hugo with some of the poor children of Guernsey. He would end up giving them meals on a regular basis. He continued to produce books, Les Châtiments, a volume of poetry, Les Contemplations, La Légende des siècles. So all of these books, of course, were being read and discussed in France, and he was continuing his interest in social injustices within his poetry. He campaigned very strongly against slavery throughout the world, and he even wrote a letter to the US government, which was also printed in London, asking that the life of John Brown could be spared. So Victor Hugo's influence is credited with the removal of the death penalty in Geneva, in Portugal, and in Colombia. So people were listening to what he had to say, and it was certainly making an impact. Here we can see a first edition of Les Misérables. Now, the first volume was published all over Europe simultaneously, which took a phenomenal amount of organization. And this was the very first novel in the history of the world to be published simultaneously on the same day in different countries throughout Europe. He was paid 300,000 francs for the writing of this book. It was a phenomenal amount of money, and in so many ways, this novel broke new ground when it came to publishing history. In 1878, Victor Hugo suffered from a stroke, but he refused to slow down. Juliette moved in with him, but he still popped out occasionally to see other women. He was not going to slow down. He wrote a delightful book called L'Art d'être grand-père, or The Art of Being a Grandfather. And here you can see him with his son's two children, his grandchildren. And they absolutely adored him. They called him their papa and thought he was the most marvelous grandfather. But on one occasion, his grandson wandered into the room when Victor Hugo was actually making love to a teenage laundress. And the boy started to scurry out of the room, but his grandfather called him back and said, "Look, little Georges, this is what they call genius." So there's no doubt he was very full of himself. He loved exploring, so wherever he was living, he would really enjoy traveling around, seeing different places. Now, as I mentioned, he was a talented artist, and these are some of his artworks. He was particularly talented as a black and white painter, and several books have been written about the art of Victor Hugo. Van Gogh and Delacroix both found inspiration in his art. His books were selling incredibly well around the world, and he wrote about his rival, William Shakespeare, making it very clear, of course, that he was infinitely better than Shakespeare. He had never actually read a Shakespeare play, and he understood no English, but he knew that he was much better than William Shakespeare. In 1866, he published Toilers of the Sea, a novel set in Guernsey. As a result of him writing this novel, a fashion throughout France for eating squid resulted. So he was influencing food fashions as well as so much else. Tragically, his son, the father of those grandchildren, died from tuberculosis. This is a statue in one of the parks in Guernsey of Victor Hugo. He had his back to a statue of Queen Victoria not very far away. And it was felt very unfitting that Victor Hugo was basically showing his rear end to the Queen. So they built a sort of pavilion between the two statues so that the poor Queen was not forced to look at the back of Victor Hugo. He commented, "There is only one classic in this century, only one, do you understand? It is me." So definitely not a man who suffered from modesty. In 1868, his wife Adele died in his arms. She was actually buried in France, so her body was taken to France, and he was able to accompany her body to the border of France, but he was not actually allowed to enter the country. But by this time, things were changing in France. Finally, there was a fall of empire, a republic was proclaimed, and after 19 years in exile, Victor Hugo was able to go to a train station in Brussels and say, "A ticket to Paris, s'il vous plaît." So he bought that ticket, he got onto the train, and the train was met by phenomenal crowds when it arrived in Paris. He was 68 years of age, and he was coming home to his capital city. Juliet had not wanted to come back. She felt she could keep him to herself much more in Guernsey. And very rapidly he was back to his old ways with mistresses. He had a particular code for erotic entries in his diary, so we do know exactly what it was he was getting up to. Soon all his plays were back on in the theatre. He met the great actress Sarah Bernhardt and probably had an affair with her. And at the age of 70, he began a new affair with a Jewish actress called Judith Mendes, and you can see her here. This affair lasted for 5 years, and in the picture on the right, she has been painted by John Singer Sargent. He continued to produce novels, poems, and plays, and by this time was idolized as the great glory of the French Republic. There were official tributes with statues, streets named after him, national orations. The common people adored Victor Hugo. Tragically, he lost another son. In 1871, his son Charles died from apoplexy. He was in Paris during the siege of Paris in the Franco-Prussian War. He ended up eating some of the animals that were donated to him by the local zoo because they couldn't afford to feed the animals and people were starving. He commented that he was eating the unknown. He became something of an advocate for the United States of Europe. He felt it would be better if Europe sort of merged and became one enormous entity. An 1876 massacre in the Balkans inspired him to write a work called Pour la Serbie, or For Serbia, and this was published in his son's newspaper. And this speech would become sort of one of the founding documents of the European ideal and the sense of a sort of united Europe. He also fought hard to protect copyright law, something that was still very lax indeed in Europe at that time. And he became a foundation member of an association fighting for the protection of an author's copyright. He was a very early supporter of the idea of works being in the public domain, but some money still needed to go to the artist or the author. And he spoke out very frequently on the rights of children. So this is a man who did a huge amount to change the France of his day. Now, he was a Catholic when he was young, then he became a non-practicing Catholic, then he became an anti-Catholic. But he never ceased to believe in God. And while he was in exile in Guernsey, he very frequently attended seances, which of course have become very fashionable indeed at that time. He stipulated in his will that he should be buried without a crucifix and without a priest, and yet he did pray very frequently. He was very friendly with different musicians, Berlioz and Liszt. He did not like the music of Wagner, a man of talent coupled with imbecility, he commented. But Hugo, of course, inspired a huge amount of music. So his influence there was enormous. Excuse me. In 1882, he celebrated his 80th birthday. This is a bust of him done by the great French sculptor Rodin, which I think captures a great deal of Victor Hugo's power. By this time, Hugo was seen as the center of the literary world, just as Notre Dame was the center of the city of Paris. For celebrating his 80th birthday, there was one of the largest parades in the whole of French history, and he was presented with a Sèvres vase, something that was normally only ever presented to French monarchs. Rodin said he was something of a tiger or an old lion. He had an immense animal nature. His eyes were especially beautiful, and they were the most striking things about him. Juliet, the very faithful and adoring Juliet, was by this time ill with stomach cancer, but she still continued to care for him, putting her own needs behind those of Victor Hugo. She died in 1883 after being with him for 55 years. She was 77 when she died. And from that time on, nobody was allowed to mention the name of Juliette in his presence. He had adored her so much. By this time, his health was poor. He was suffering from a lesion of the heart and congestion of the lungs. But this caricature shows how the man sat astride the whole of Paris. And there you can see Notre Dame in the background and many of the other great buildings of Paris. Eventually, he seems to have lost the will to live, and he became seriously unwell. Official bulletins were issued every day about the state of his health. On the 22nd of May, 1885, Victor Hugo said farewell to his grandchildren, and he died. It is thought from probably pneumonia. He was 83 years of age. Huge crowds turned out for the funeral of Victor Hugo. It is thought that 2 million people joined the procession of this author. It's impossible for us to imagine in Australia today 2 million people turning out for the funeral of a poet and novelist. In his will, he left 50,000 francs to the poor of Paris. Now, he was buried in the Panthéon, and the Arc de Triomphe was draped in black flags, especially for the funeral of Victor Hugo. The Panthéon was actually secularized, especially for Victor Hugo, and critics commented that Jesus was being expelled in order to make room for this author. Victor Hugo had become a god, and in one temple there could not be two. So the Arc de Triomphe was hung with black crepe. Millions of people were following what was happening at the funeral, and his legacy, and here you can see his grave in the Panthéon, his legacy was extraordinary. He wrote 20 volumes of poetry, 9 novels, 10 plays, mainly in verse, and a lot of other things as well. He wanted an end to capital punishment. He wanted universal suffrage, free and compulsory education, and some things that in most parts of the world today we take for granted. He can sometimes be irritating as a writer, and this picture shows the funeral orations that were given to him. He is very long-winded indeed. He can manage to find 10 adjectives for one noun. He is famed, of course, for his digressions, particularly in Les Misérables. There are some passages of mediocrity. Sometimes I think he was wanting in humour, and there are certainly some historical inaccuracies. But what we get in his fiction and in his poetry is grand, rich language, marvellous imagery, and of course, truly superb poetry and rhetoric. So Victor Hugo is rightly celebrated not only in France, but around the world today. And here you can see his face on various stamps from Poland to Germany to Monaco to Russia, all over the place, giving you some idea of the immense reach and influence of this great writer. And there you can see him once again. So let's have a look at Les Misérables and how this novel was able to break new ground. Very few of his French contemporary authors lived by the pen, and the idea of intellectual property was very much in its infancy. Books were luxury items, but the demand for reading material was growing. Now, around 1860, so just before he wrote Les Misérables, steel stereotype steam presses were invented. So that meant that publishing became cheaper and easier. Cheaper paper was also starting to appear and to lower the cost of producing a book. So really, Les Misérables came at exactly the right time, taking into consideration all of this new technology. Printed books were being democratized for people around Europe. In 1852, France persuaded Belgium to sign the first truly international copyright treaty. But Belgium was not subject to French censorship law, which you can see illustrated in this picture. So that is why Les Misérables was published in Brussels, not in France, because of course he was a writer in exile. His novel would have been very carefully scrutinized by the French censors, but by publishing it in Brussels, he was able to avoid all of that. And here you can see the piles of the manuscript of Les Misérables. Now, publishers, of course, when he first purchased the novel from Victor Hugo, the book wasn't even finished. So the publisher didn't even know how long the book would be. Victor Hugo was still busy writing it. But the deal that he made with the publisher included translation rights, something very unusual for that time, barely invented. And it gave the publisher rights for only the next 8 years. So Victor Hugo's contract with the publisher really broke new ground in publishing history. He was paid around £3 million today in money for his manuscript. And this was the highest price that had ever been paid for any book ever. It was the biggest deal in all of book history. And the book was not even finished when the deal was made. And there you can see the manuscript. The task of proofing it was absolutely enormous. If you think of today, an author just does a bit of copying and pasting and then emails it off to the publisher. But Victor Hugo had to do everything with quill pens and paper and ink. And then he had to post it off to his publisher in Belgium. And there was only 3 times a week a mail boat that went from Guernsey to London, and from London it then needed to go to Brussels. So Juliet and his sister-in-law spent an enormous amount of time copying things out when it came to the proofing stage. And this is an original letterbox in Guernsey in Saumarez Street. These letterboxes had been introduced into the Channel Islands just a few years before by one of my very favourite novelists, Anthony Trollope, another innovator. And so Victor Hugo would post his manuscript into this letterbox, preserved, it's behind pillars today, and he would send it off via the boat to London and then Brussels. So there was not yet a typewriter for him to use, nor was there carbon paper for him to use. And his publisher, Lacroix, had to get his stock to all of the major capital cities of Europe on the same day in order to avoid pirated editions of the novels appearing. So this book, in so many ways, broke historical records when it came to the actual publishing of it. Now, while awaiting the next lot of proofs to appear, Victor Hugo began giving his poor dinners to children in Guernsey. It began with 10 children, and he served them meat and, interestingly, wine. And then the numbers very rapidly doubled. Then they became a weekly event. So every week he would, at his own expense, feed poor children on the island. Word of this initiative spread, and it became so famous, the idea was taken up in London. And by 1867, 60,000 poor urchins were being fed by various parishes along the lines set out by Victor Hugo. And the idea was so popular, it eventually led to school lunches all over Britain. So another way in which this extraordinary man broke new ground. So when the book came out and it was published by this man, Albert Lacroix, it was, of course, an immensely long book, 365 chapters that came out in different volumes. Publication had gone to the highest bidder, and it was the Belgian house, Lacroix and Verboeckhoven, who undertook an enormous marketing campaign and then produced the novel. They marketed the book 6 months before its launch, and this was, again, very unusual. They actually had a campaign with people walking around with billboards advertising the book, the very first time this had ever been done. Illustrations of the characters were put up on posters to encourage interest in this coming novel, and the posters were plastered all over Paris. But Hugo's wife, this was, of course, before she died, was very busy preparing material for newspapers, but they could only use it on a particular day. And all this meant that, material about the novel was kept secret until eventually there was a grand day of publicity. So Les Misérables became the very first book in the history of the world to be launched under an embargo. So they would send information to people, but they couldn't use it until that particular day. This may be an apocryphal story, but I do love it, so I want to share it with you. And it's about the very shortest telegram correspondence in the history of the world. Victor Hugo was on vacation when his novel began to come out, and he wanted to know the reaction to the work. So he sent a telegram to the publisher with simply a question mark. And the publisher replied with simply an exclamation mark. So the shortest telegram correspondence in history. The book was dedicated to the people of Guernsey, which you can see here in a 19th century painting. And the novel was released, or the first parts of it, released on the very same day in Brussels, Leipzig, London, St. Petersburg, and other major cities around Europe. That was the 4th of April, 1862. And you can imagine all of this being done by post, the organisation to make sure that copies were got to the right places, they were held under embargo until finally that day came when everybody could bring out the novel on the same day. The first printing in Paris sold out on the very first day. So this really was the world's first international book launch, and it was the first 2 volumes that came out on that day. The book was not so loved by critics, but it was hugely popular with the masses, and the social issues that it raised were widely discussed. And the book would include dates that were hugely important in Victor Hugo's own life, something picked up by James Joyce when he came to write Ulysses, and he would use dates that had meant a great deal to him. The social issues that Victor Hugo raised were discussed by the National Assembly in France. So the full release of the novel, and here you can see a first edition, took 3 months, with the final volumes 4 and 5 coming out in June 1862. Pirated editions appeared very quickly, and the USA did not at that time recognize European copyright. So around the world, workers' clubs would buy copies and people would read it aloud to each other in cafes and in halls. Soon it was in the theatre. Victor Hugo's son Charles he wrote a script for the play, but the authorities cancelled it in Paris. After all, this author was still in exile. But there were play versions all over Europe, in Yiddish, in Polish, in Russian. The first musical version came out in Philadelphia in 1863. In 1897, a very early cinematographer created a tiny bit of film showing Victor Hugo, Jean Valjean, Thénardier, Marius, and Javert. And this would be the very first entrance into film of any novel ever written. So once again, this book is breaking new ground. It is today the most frequently adapted novel into film of any novel ever. And many of the different film versions are sort of monuments in cinema history. There was a 6-hour silent film version. The very first sound version came out in 1934. And there have been at least 65 different screen versions of Les Misérables. Now, there was talk of the French government impounding the book. A newspaper with a picture of Hugo in it was pulped, and the Catholic Church placed it on the list of prohibited books, which you can see in this picture. So the various volumes continued to appear. Interest was at fever pitch, with huge advertisements accompanying all the new volumes as they came out. There were phenomenal queues. Police were needed to control them. There had been nothing like it in the entire history of bookselling. And other publishers just simply stopped bringing out new books because nobody was interested. All they wanted to buy was Les Misérables. Here you can see Victor Hugo in his downstairs study. He does have his clothes on in this picture. Finally, he finished writing the last volume and he wept over it. I felt I was present at the death of a dear and beloved friend, he commented. Translators from the very beginning were standing by to get this book into other languages, English, Spanish, German, and Italian. It is not an easy book to translate, but it is universal in its message. And Victor Hugo said, wherever men are ignorant and desperate, wherever women sell themselves for bread, wherever children suffer for want of instruction or a warm hearth, Les Misérables knocks on the door and says, open up, I have come for you. A man called Charles Wilbur translated it in 6 months, which is quite a feat considering the length of the book, in the United States, and it was to have an enormous impact on the anti-slavery movement in the States. In fact, Robert E. Lee's soldiers, who all read it as they were taking part in the American Civil War, called themselves Les Miserables as a result of the book. And there you can see one of the American versions of the novel. Other books have been written, of course, using Les Misérables as their inspiration, Cosette, various others that you can see there. Some of these authors have been taken to court by Victor Hugo's descendants. There have been graphic versions of the book. It has appeared in radio plays. The audiobook version only lasts for about 67 hours, but the reader has actually won major awards for his reading of this book, and he does a fantastic job. There has been merchandise connected with Les Misérables as well. Since publication, this book has remained in the forefront of high-selling books around the world. It's a book about crime and punishment and what it means to try and live a good life in this world. This shows one of the earliest film versions, a silent film version in 1935. There's this version with Frederick March and Charles Lawton. This is the 1935 version. There's a version with that had Cyril Cusack and Flora Robson. There's a huge range of different film versions. And of course, the famous musical, which came out in 1985 and gave the novel a whole new spurt of popularity. There's a 1980 film with Liam Neeson and Geoffrey Rush, the Australian actor. There's a 2000 miniseries with Gerard Depardieu. You can't possibly have not have Gerard Depardieu acting in this series, and also John Malkovich as Javert. There's a film of the musical, which of course starred Hugh Jackman, who did a lovely job, and Russell Crowe as Javert. And more recently, in 2018, there was a BBC television series written by Andrew Davies and featuring Dominic West, Lily Collins, and David Oyelowo. So a black Javert there in that film version. I am going to go just sort of 5 or so minutes over time, so I hope you will all excuse me. The book continued to be published. It was hugely popular in the Soviet Union, as you can see from this picture. Even in their darkest years of literary censorship, they still approved of Victor Hugo's novel, and he remained the most widely read French author in the whole of the USSR. It was read by student groups, by rebellions, by people in rebellions, by socialists and communists. It was read by everybody. So it is, of course, a great social novel. And Jean Valjean has become a sort of universal symbol of tyranny and a man trying to rise above being captured for what was a very petty crime. Les Misérables is an exciting and powerful novel, beginning with the depths of human misery, charting the rise and fall of its convict hero and his final acceptance of fate. It is set against all the political upheavals in France of that time, And it begins with the Battle of Waterloo, which perhaps is sort of the birth of modern France. And on a cold autumn night in 1815, and Jean Valjean is looked after by the saintly bishop and ends up being reformed by the goodness of this man. So the bishop has Jean Valjean staying with him, and Jean ends up stealing the candlesticks. The next day, the prisoner is brought back to the house. It looks like he's going to be locked up again. A hideous fate awaits him, and there are the soldiers with Jean Valjean. And the bishop looks at him and feels that there is a way to save this poor, haunted man. And the scene with the soldiers and the bishop and poor Jean Valjean are superbly done at the beginning of the novel. And eventually he ends up saying, "But you forgot to take the candlesticks with you. You took the silver plate, but you didn't take the candlestick." And the soldiers are amazed, and they think, well, were these things given to this man? We thought that he had stolen them. And the bishop says, no, I gave him the candlesticks, and he must take them away with him. And at the end, he says, "Jean Valjean, my brother, you no longer belong to evil, but to good. I have bought your soul of you. I withdraw it from black thoughts and the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God." And so Jean Valjean goes away, and as a result of the bishop and his actions, he becomes a better man. So there you can see some of the scenes from different film versions of that very powerful moment early on in the novel. And there's Gérard Depardieu as Jean Valjean. His French, interestingly, is accentless, and we hear very little of the other accents in the book. Now, he was, of course, a farmhand. He reads books, but that doesn't tend to change accents. So Victor Hugo very deliberately gave him sort of no accent so that he could not be placed in a particular part of French society. He's very loosely based on a man called Eugène Vidocq, who was an ex-convict who became head of an undercover police unit and founded France's first private detective agency. Of course, his nemesis, Jean Valjean, is Javert, the police inspector. And Victor Hugo had taken notes about the position of convicts, the behavior of policemen. He knew what he was writing about when he created Javert. And he asks in the book when it is that a human being becomes lost to society. Surely there is always a moment when he can be reclaimed. And he wanted to show the great inequality between the criminal treatment of the poor and the rich. So he worked very, very hard at the realism of this novel. Here we can see Fantine in a portrait by a painting by Margaret Hall. In 1841, Victor Hugo had actually saved a prostitute from arrest for assault. And so Fantine is a prostitute. So he was quite brave, making a major and very sympathetic character in his novel a prostitute. And of course, her daughter is little Cosette. Originally named Euphrasie, she is illegitimate, she is abused, and she's a wonderful heroine of the novel. So he had been to this convict settlement at Toulon, the Le Bagne de Toulon. He had taken notes. He wanted to make sure that his picture of 19th century crime and punishment in France was as accurate as it could be. And of course, Jean Valjean spends a lot of time hiding away in a convent. And I think that Victor Hugo shows that convents were just another form of imprisonment. Many aristocratic women were sent by their families willy-nilly to live in convents. They were legal minors. They often had very little rights, and choice was taken away from them. And that is what he shows in the convent scenes in the novel. And there are many forms of imprisonment. Jean Valjean is able to escape by hiding in a coffin, and he has to be smuggled out, and he's almost buried alive. So he has to come out of the coffin almost like a resurrection. The plight of the poor is looked at so strongly in this novel. Jean Valjean steals bread because of hunger, and he is given a savage sentence, and this turns him into a hardened man. The book was originally called Les Misères, or The Miseries, and it's interesting to note that most translators do not try to translate the title of this novel. It is usually Les Misérables, which is a hard word to translate, sort of meaning the miserable ones, but also those who live in poverty, those who are outcasts in some way in society. Perhaps the Indian term of untouchables captures some of the title. Some English versions have subtitled it The Wretched, but I don't think that really does it justice. When Victor Hugo published the book, some critics felt that he had, quote, wasted his genius on the subject of the poor, and the book was seen as dangerous in case it might incite the masses. And of course, one of the great symbols of the poor in the novel is the young urchin Gavroche, one of the most appealing characters in the book. So his death is one of the great tragedies of the novel. The book covers so much, and I'm not doing full justice to it tonight, but the theme of paternity is important. The two fathers, Thénardier, who you can see here in the picture, and Pontmercy, meet at the Battle of Waterloo. This will foreshadow the later meeting of their children in the course of the novel. Jean Valjean becomes a sort of father, but also a grandfather to young Cosette. And Marius moves backwards and forwards between the political views of his father and his grandfather. And money, of course, is a hugely important theme in the book. We hear that Jean Valjean is very good at adding up figures. The Thénardiers, sort of some of the villains of the novel, are very obsessive about money. And the bishop gives Jean Valjean those silver candlesticks and says, "It is your soul that I am buying." Now, the novel is famed for its digressions, and some readers do complain about them. One of the most famous is the Waterloo digression, which goes for 69 pages within the book. But there are many others as well. A digression on slang, one on convents, one on the sewers. The Waterloo one may not seem particularly relevant to the book, but Victor Hugo felt it was extremely symbolic and it suited the epic purpose of his novel. And I love the sewer digression. I find it absolutely fascinating. And the sewers, of course, are seen as a sort of prison, a place of nightmare, and it's there that Jean Valjean finds safety and security, and it's there that he carries Marius to safety on his back, almost like Christ carrying the cross. So the religious symbolism is hugely important. Jean Valjean can ascend from the sewers back into a full and rich life as a better human being. Sometimes Victor Hugo is a little unrestrained when it comes to his digressions, but I think they are a fabulous part of the book and they should not be skipped. So this is a truly wonderful book, and I have recommended it in the reading list, the novel of the century. This is a very big claim, but after reading this book, I have to say that this book had broken new ground in so many ways that it can very aptly be described as the novel of the century. So do read this truly excellent book by David Bellos. And just to finish off, the American writer Upton Sinclair called Les Misérables one of the half-dozen greatest novels of the world. It's certainly one of the longest novels ever written. It's 655,478 words. That is a lot of writing. And the famous digressions take up a quarter of the book. And yet one critic has said that those digressions are, quote, the spiritual gateway to the novel. Victor Hugo drew on his life experiences, so much that he had seen, entries in his diary, the experiences of his mistress. So much comes into this rich and truly wonderful novel. So I think that Les Misérables is a book that everybody should read in their lifetime. Make sure that you don't miss out on this great masterpiece by the wonderful French trailblazer, Victor Hugo. So thank you all. Merci for joining me this evening. It has been really wonderful to have your company. If you don't get my monthly newsletter, you can sign up for it. In fact, I'll leave this picture on for a moment. You can actually scan that with your phone, and that will take you straight to the page that you need to sign up for my free newsletter, which comes out on the first day of every month. Thank you all for joining me. I am very happy now to take some questions. If anyone wants to stay on to ask any questions, I am very happy indeed to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susan. That was fantastic. I just want to mention one translator. I had talked to her in Alliance Française about 5 years ago. Julie Rose, she's an Australian translator. And she was very enlightening in her telling about translating Victor Hugo's Les Misérables.
Oh, how fascinating. Wow, it would be really interesting to talk to a translator about the challenges.
It was amazing. She brought so many details. Unfortunately, I forgot most of it, but she was amazing. Julie Rose.
Oh, thank you very much for that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, of course, what a mammoth task to translate this novel.
Oh, God, yes.
Words and the nuances and the historical detail. You know, my mind can't even comprehend the vastness of a task like that. So I'm very grateful to wonderful translators, because my French isn't good enough to read this novel in the original, sadly. But I would love to be able to read it in the original, but many of us are forced to, of course, to read it in translation. So thank you for that. So any other questions that people would like to ask?
Susanna, can I just ask, in light of our last night's talk, what was James Joyce's feeling about Hugo and Les Misérables?
Oh, I was giving it, for those of you who weren't at it, I was giving a Zoom talk on James Joyce and Ulysses. To be honest, I don't know.
No, he was very critical of.
Well, he was. I think he was influenced by the way in which Victor Hugo used very personal dates that mattered to him. But how much else he was influenced by, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think the two men would have had a lot in common.
No, I think Joyce. I mean, because it was a different time, of course. But Joyce was very critical of some of his contemporaries.
Yes,
history and so forth.
And he wasn't crazy about 19th century fiction. He felt it was too standard.
This is something light. I really enjoyed our tour of Hugo's house. It was wonderful, and all those.
Yes, it was extraordinary, wasn't it?
All those plates on the ceiling. I thought I might do it when I got home, but I decided I wouldn't.
I'm quite relieved, Faye.
Yeah.
I have never seen such an over-decorated house in my entire life.
That's
we
right.
were all eyes out on stalks. We'd never seen anything like it.
And Susanna, you mentioned Chateaubriand. Well, I thought that was a steak.
It is, and the steak was named after the writer. And these days, if you Google his name, it tends to be the steak that comes up first. Okay. But actually, it was named for Chateaubriand, who was very fond of steak and prepared it that way. And so that was his influence on French cuisine. But you're quite right that it is a steak, but the writer came first.
Thank you. And I really enjoyed that talk.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions? I hope you all had a nice glass of French wine to accompany this talk.
Yes,
I have gone on a little bit, but hopefully you've been well lubricated with a nice drink. So next week, of course, we are having a look at one of the great artists of French history and a truly fascinating man, Paul Cézanne, one of my favourite artists ever. He barely sold a painting in his lifetime, and yet his influence on art, the art world, and also on writers was absolutely phenomenal. And of course, one of his dearest friends was the great French novelist Émile Zola. So I'll be talking a bit about Zola, their friendship, the struggles that Cézanne had to become accepted as an artist, his love of literature, and so much more. And of course, his fascination for Mont Saint-Victoire, which he painted again and again and again. So we'll be heading to the south of France with the next lecture. Cézanne was not very fond of Paris. He couldn't see the point of living in Paris when you could live in Provence. So a bit of travel around France next time as we head south for one of the great artists in world history. So if you have not already booked, I do hope you'll join me for the talk on Cézanne, a truly fascinating man. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
And I look forward to seeing you next week for Paul Cézanne.